So what I'm going to talk about today is really just, thinking about MMT in China. I will briefly mention some sort of recent debates about MMT in China at the very beginning, and then I will move on to my own sort of work, applying the MMT lens to look at China's development experience and make some policy suggestions. So feel free to stop me anytime if you have any burning questions or clarifying questions. I do have 41 slides, but I'm sure I'm not going to zoom through all of them. So feel free to let me know which part you would like for me to elaborate. And the sound is okay? That is my biggest volume. So, all right, so this is exactly what I just talked about. Start with the MMT debates, and then look at MMT from look at China's growth from a MMT perspective, and then make some policy suggestions. The debates. So there has been really lively debate about MMT in China at the very high level. I'm talking about people like the Deputy Administrator of the State Administration of Foreign Exchanges, and people like the Director of Monetary Policy Department at the Central Bank, who was just jailed last month for insider trading scandals. But nonetheless, this is just a picture to show that MMT had an inroad, right, into China's policymaking and academic circle. But unfortunately, there are a lot of misconceptions of MMT. As you can read through some of these quotes, I translated them from Chinese into English. So if it doesn't make sense, then it probably doesn't. No, not your fault. So one of the arguments here is that MMT is all about quantitative easing, right? It's all about the central bank purchases the treasuries, right? And by way of doing that, they are able to, inject liquidity. They are able to set the interest rate low, so they help to boost the so-called solvency of sovereign government, right? And then the second quote here, oh, by the way, they also said that MMT worsens inequality because inflates asset price that enriches the business oligarchs in the United States. And then the rising consumer price then impoverish, right, the average Americans. So that's the view. And the second point here is to say that MMT only applies to China's past, where the fiscal authority is in charge of, money creation. Whereas now, China, like many other modern monetary system, is a central bank that is take charge of the monetary policy. So it's no longer working for China, right? Then the last quote here to say, MMT is all about monetize deficits, right? Deficit spending. But China should not do that. Why? We still have very sufficient so-called fiscal space, right? The government debt to GDP ratio is less than 60%, about 40-some%. And China's inflationary pressure is very low. But, we need to watch out, right, for that inflation that is exported, right, by countries like the United States and European unions, right? And we also don't want it to do that because that's going to undermine the so-called central banking independence, which is a hard-earned sort of reality since 1995, the government banking reform. So we should not go back to the old road, okay? So these are some of the arguments. On the other hand, there are some excellent insights from the Chinese scholars and policy advisors. So the first one here is a very high-level economics scholar and also former policy advisor to both the central bank and also to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who said it is a misunderstanding that MMT is advocating for endless government spending, right? That is a misinterpretation of MMT. And then some people would also say, it's really, we need to pay more attention to the scale and types of deficit spending. Right? I thought that was right on, right? That's a good idea, right? MMT supports spending on public works, infrastructure, social safety net, with the process of creating jobs and all the other wonderful stuff. So deficit spending is self-containing, right? The third point here is to say, the whole idea of central banking independence is a false proposition, right? That the Treasury and the monetary authorities have to coordinate, right? So I thought that was also an excellent idea. Then the following, these two scholars, Liang and He Zengping, they have published quite a few of scholarly work on MMT. So they address many of the questions that I think, again, still confuse a lot of the Chinese MMT scholars. So here they talked about how MMT is not about monetizing deficit. It's not about giving up the independence of central bank or whatnot. It's not about limitless government spending. MMT addressed very important questions like, there's no such a thing as crowding out effect by driving up interest rates by way of, government deficit spending, and there's no such a thing as, government spending would necessarily create inflation, right? Any form of spending can inflate, but, we just, need to make sure that we not only just, increase government spending when the economy doesn't need it, right? And we also need to increase government spending by creating, I think Fadal and other people have talked about earlier, right? That strategic supplies of some essential, needs, right, for the economy. And the last quote here talked about how the Ministry of Finance, which is the Treasury counterpart, right, in China, and the PBOC, the People's Banks of China, they will have to coordinate so that they can increase the efficiency and capacity of macroeconomic governance. So there's some excellent insights. So to set the record straight, I don't think I need to go through this very much because I think after the whole 1.5 days immersion, right, into MMT, right? I think you already kind of understand many of this stuff, right? So MMT describes how fiscal and monetary operations work for a monetary sovereign government. MMT is not about QE, it's not about monetizing deficit, because as Stephanie puts it very elegantly, right? It's not tax, right? It's not tax bond sales before you spend. It's actually step, right? You spend first, you tax and sell bonds for other reasons. So I think what is important to understand here is that really what is the purpose of government spending and tax, right? It's to mobilize resources to advance public good, and however that public good is defined and democratically accountable, right? And finally, for developing countries like China, I think MMT provides not only some of the demand side suggestions in terms of how we can manage demand, but more importantly, some of the structural transformation, right? Some of the so-called supply side, right? I think policy suggestions. Okay, so I would start then. I will put that debates aside now, just to go through some of my own sort of work on how to apply the MMT lens. And I want to start by talking about preserving monetary sovereignty, right? So I think, as we heard from the previous panel, in the developing world, many countries are not able to do so. They're not able to have that full monetary sovereignty because of, again, there's the historical legacy, right? There's the colonization. There was a lot of legacy comes from that history, but then there are also very misheaded, policies, right? So in this case, I would say, China is doing relatively a good job in preserving that monetary sovereignty. For one is China has adopted, capital control since the 90s, right? When they opened up the so-called current account, they have remained really effective control on the capital account, even though that started to recently change, right? Back, I think it's last year, 2022. 2020, right, the government started to gradually open up more and more the capital account. But nonetheless, from the data, as you can see here, the FDI inflows is a lot more than the portfolio inflows, right? So these are relatively long-term, they're relatively greenfield, they're relatively resilient and stable, and provide some sort of benefits, right? And they try to keep the portfolio investment at bay. China also accumulated a lot of the foreign exchange reserves. And again, there are different debates about what's the motivation behind, right? It is a mercantilism policy, or is it China trying to safeguard its financial order, right? But in any case, China does accumulate a lot of foreign exchange reserves over time. So if you go by the traditional benchmark, right, you wanted to have reserves that are 3 months worth of your exports. China has 5 times more than that, okay? So that exchange reserves help to preserve sort of the monetary sovereignty and stabilize financial order. This is just to show that China does not have much external debt. So right now it's looking at about 15%, the foreign debt to GDP ratio. And again, if you sort of looked at World Bank, for example, their debt sustainability framework, they said for a medium country's capacity to be able to handle debt, we want that share to be less than 40-50%, right? So China is much less than that. In terms of debt service to export ratio, we're looking at about 9%, which is again much lower than the World Bank standard of about 15%, right? And finally, China used to have very much sort of packed exchange rate, as you see from 1994, when China started to have the exchange rate reform. They devalued the currency from about 5.2 yuan to $1 to 8.27 8.7 yuan per dollar. And then they maintained that peg for a relatively long period of time from 1994 to 2005. But since then, they started to flexibilize, right, to reform, to reduce the peg, but use a basket of a currency, but they also increase the band within which the RMB is allowed to fluctuate. Right? So some flexible sort of exchange rate arrangements, again, help to preserve that currency, sort of the monetary sovereignty. So if there's any question, I'm happy to go back to this, but I think some other folks have already talked about this concept of monetary sovereignty, right? So we don't want it to have, fixed exchange rate and free capital mobility, and with those two, then we're not going to be able to have the autonomous monetary policy making, right? The well-known sort of the impossible trinity or the trilemma, right? But I think after you learn about MMT, you also understand that fiscal capacity will be also lost, right? If you have, open capital accounts, but then with fixed exchange rates. So it's really quite a dilemma that we're talking about, right? The four things cannot happen all at once. Okay, so once we kind of help to preserve the monetary sovereignty, right? So we can apply some of the MMT informed policies. We can in some ways sort of practice, right, what the MMT would subscribe. Then how China was able to harness the public money, right, to advance its development interest, right? How China was able to use public money to provide development finance, right? So just a little bit theoretical stuff. Jan Kregel, who I think some of you are familiar with his work, right? He talked about the so-called two obstacles to development. So there is the obstacle of the financing constraint, but there's also the real resources constraint, right? So the mainstream analysis and recommendation is that, developing countries are financially constrained. The income is too low. They spend too much on consumption. They don't have enough savings, and they don't have foreign exchange to purchase the imports, right? So the so-called two-saving gap. So how do we do that? Well, we need to force people to save, right? Through financial repression, for example. Keep the interest rate very low so people don't save. Keep the interest rate high so people will save more, right? Or we have to use policies to attract foreign capital inflows. So the sole aim of development policy is reduced to how we accommodate, right, to court the foreign investors, to bring the foreign savings into the country to finance our development, right? But the problem here is, as you are well aware of, right, as I think the previous panel has very eloquently explained, right, attracting and also relying on external financing is infeasible on two grounds. One is that there is simply no net financial resource transfer from the rich to the poor. It's the reverse. I think Fadao mentioned something along the lines of $2 trillion annually, right? The financial resources go from the developing countries to the developed countries. So this chart is from the United Nations. So what it shows is that between 2000 and 2017, every year, on average, there are about $500 billion of net resources transfer from the developing world to the developed world. And the most recent data, it's even more disastrous, right? Developing countries in total own $11 trillion external debt, and $3.9 trillion debt services are due by 2020. And average government debt payment account for about 14% of their revenue. So thinking about, the COVID-wrecked Harvard economy, where there's so much needs for government spending, and yet the government is sending away 14% of their revenue to the foreign creditors or investors, right? So in other words, if you wanted to attract foreign capital, it's a mirage. You can't do it, right? As the developing countries as a whole. Well, but then you might say, maybe China is able to do that, or maybe Brazil is able to do that, right? Or maybe whatever country that is able to do that, right? But the point, though, is going back to what Kregel was arguing, this idea that we can continue to attract new flows would mean we have to keep borrowing new loans to pay back the debt services on the own loans, right? That's the only way you get the net inflows. And so that is what? Ponzi, thank you very much, right? Very good. So those are the two reasons why we do not want to rely on foreign savings, right? And in addition, I think MMT provides great insights on this. As you know, some of you, all of you have listened to Randy's earlier speech, right? So he talked about how MMT is a confluence of different heterodox approaches, right? So one of the things I think is important to understand is the distinction between credit and saving, right? Financing and funding. They're different, right? Saving comes at the end. Saving is a byproduct of income growth, right? We have to have credit and financing to kick off production. Production creates income, income gets saved. That's where the savings come from. You can't put the cart ahead of the horse, right? So we need financing, we need credit, and saving will come, right? And credit can be created at two levels, at the state level and also at the banking level, right? The state spends money into existence, and the private sector borrows money into existence. And the state always makes sure these two levels of credits are traded at par. And so development financing needs to be, and it has always been, primarily domestic. Okay? So in specifically China's case, there are three practices I think it's worth noting, and of course there are much, much more. The first thing is to establish development policy banks and also state-owned, state-controlled, state-influenced commercial banks. So what do they do? Well, the state-owned development banks are instrumental in the long-term development planning and also infrastructure building, right? They also provide, the sharing of costs of discovery of new technologies and productive processes. They also finance the projects that are with the current, non-economically viable, but long-term beneficial both economically and socially, the kinds of projects, right? So in China, for example, the Development Bank was established in 1994, and it's actively involved in the 5-year plan. It has contributed to regional planning, industrial planning, and many of the mega projects in China. I don't know how many of you had a chance to visit China. I myself haven't been back since the pandemic. I mean, actually even before that, 2018. But if you get the chance to travel, right, in China, I would strongly recommend you to visit some of the sites like the Three Gorge Dam, right? I think that's really human wonder, right? One of the biggest hydraulic projects, right, hydraulic power projects in China. Also the Shanghai Pudong International Airport, right? So a lot of these large scale projects that take years to come into fruition, not going to generate any net present value in the short term. These are the projects where the Development Bank have been taking part of, right, and leading in the construction of these mega projects. The state-owned banks also, they account for about 45% of the total assets right now. And all of these banks are able to generate a lot of finance for investment, right? As many of you have heard about that China's investment-driven economy. To some degree, yes, that is the case, right? So the very bright yellow column is how much the investment growth contributes to real GDP growth, okay? So the last data that I sent there is the investment growth contributes to 1.11 percentage points to GDP growth. So this is from the supply, sort of the factor of production side, right? So capital, as you see, that blue column is the contribution of that capital to GDP growth over the years. Again, very significant contribution. And some people would argue, well, China is growing really by improving the productivity, the so-called TFP, the total factor productivity. Well, be that as it may, without the kinds of investment, right, without building, without manufacturing, without fabricating, how you're going to be able to improve your productivity, right? So I think those two go hand in hand. A lot of the investments are done not only by the private sector, but also by the public sector. This data ends in 2015. This is an IMF data sets. I wish I could have more, but as any of you who work with Chinese economy, you understand how difficult it is to get the data from the official government's side. So I look forward to kind of looking more deeply and see if we can get more data to the more recent years, simply because there's this argument about state advancing, private sector retreating. So I really wanted to see that in data, if the government is, encroaching on, right, sort of the investment projects that sort of belong to the private sector. And I will get back to that point later. Here is a sectoral division of the investments. Real estate, infrastructure, and secondary industry take up the most of these investments. So there might be some, I think, argument, which I think makes some sense, that we wanted to, in a way, diversify away from real estate sector. So again, we can talk about what is the way to do that, right? So this goes to the recent sort of arguments that, the government is investing too much, right? So as a result, the efficiency of capital formation is declining. So that shows on the left-hand panel, that we see that you need more and more capital to produce every $1 of GDP, right? The so-called incremental capital output ratio has been increasing. And as a result of that, that has been increasing, right? Because if investment becomes less efficient, that means we're generating less and less profits, which means we're less and less able to pay back, right, that investment financing. So as a result, we see the accumulation of debt by the non-financial corporations, and also some government and household debt, right? So this is the argument that we need to somehow tie the hands of the government. We need to reduce investment. We need to rebalance the Chinese economy, right? Now, I have something to say about that, right? But let's maybe move on to the next point. Then I will talk about the policy implications. Here's the second point. How do we utilize, how do we harness public money? Well, I think China is really trying to use, the state-created sort of money and financing to support its industrial undertaking, industrial upgrading, right? So here is the industrial policy spending, which was, I did have the source there, is the Center for Security and, I can't remember exactly all the acronym. But anyway, so it's the most recent sort of publication that look at how much China spends on industrial investment, right, in that policy spending. So if you look at the second column from your left, China spends about 1.47, is it? Oh, 8. Thank you. 1.48% of the GDP on industrial policy. So there's a decomposition of what these, types of spending is, right? It largely dwarfs all the other countries, as you see from this chart. Okay, so this is a way for, again, improving the industrial capacity, help to generate more high-end manufacturing, right? The so-called smart, intelligent manufacturing. It doesn't just come naturally, right? As you see the government spending, the government incentives are right behind these kinds of technological innovation and industrial upgrading. In addition to that, direct spending from the Ministry of Finance, the government has also invested heavily in the so-called government-guided funds. Some puts the number at 1,600, others say there are 1,800 of these government-guided funds in China right now. And it has about $1.45 trillion worth of investment. And these are mostly go to the national strategic emerging industries that the Chinese government identified, around 10 of them. So one of the example is, as you understand, the semiconductor chips race, right? That China is investing heavily in the so-called National Integrated Circuit investment funds, where the Ministry of Finance contributed 36% of the capital, and now they have about $200 billion worth of investment, and mostly in the semiconductor companies. And they also acquired, most recently, a large semiconductor firm in Singapore. Okay, so this is the way, again, government trying to provide the financing to promote technological innovations and industrial upgrading. Okay. There are also some numbers here about the government spending on energies R&D. Again, China and the United States, the two countries, help to lead the way. The global R&D spending by government on energy has increased by about 5% year over year. And these two countries are, again, leading that effort. And then the right-hand side here is the government spending on the new energy vehicles, right? So all of these, again, are very important for China's technological catching up. There are some the the U.S. scholars have lamented on, the Chinese now, they're selling 4 times more EVs. They're producing 17 more times of solar panels. They're making 8 times more computers and electronics, right? So again, I think we need to kind of understand how China is able to do that, right? And I think there's a very critical role by the government, by the state money, right? In addition to some of the policies, of course. Finally, the last point that I just wanted to mention here is that just by the regular fiscal spending out of the general government budgets, they are very helpful for the economy as well. Because as you understand some of the mainstream argument, right, the Chinese are doing well because they have high savings, right? The Chinese are very thrift. They save a bunch, so they're able to finance the investment, right? But the question is, how do we generate this private surplus, right? How do we enable the households and the enterprises to save? Well, from a macro level, the sectoral balance approach, it's important to note here. The left-hand side here shows the sectoral balance of China. So if you look at the last year that I have the numbers there, the private sector surplus is the mirror effect of the combination of the external surplus and the public sector deficit, right? So is the government deficit spend, is the government deficit and external surplus, which not a whole lot, but it's positive, right? It's around can't read the number myself, 1.674% of GDP, right? So is these two allow the private sector to save, right? So the right-hand side here shows the blue line is the household saving, and the green line is the enterprises saving. So again, is the government spending that allow the private sector to save? It's not just the household's thriftiness, right? Or some sort of financial repression policies, or some kinds of other exploitative measures. So this just to show the government spending, the revenues, and also the expenditures. And as you probably already heard earlier, right, a lot of these government expenditures and spending are a result of the automatic stabilizer, right? Some of these are not really discretionary. When the economy is not doing well, for example, 2020, when China was hard hit by the coronavirus, the spending increased by a lot, the revenues dropped, so that leads to a large government deficit. And that helped to, again, stabilize the economy. Okay, so that gets us to the last point that I want to make about Mmt Informed Policies, right? As you probably have heard of, that there's all these lofty goals, right, by the Xi Jinping's administration. The idea is that from 2020 to 2035, we wanted to double the size of the Chinese GDP, okay? Which means we have to increase the GDP growth by about 5% every year to get there, okay? So how do we go about doing that? Start with the Made in China 2025 initiative, right, which is not very much talked about these days in China anymore, right, because of the pushback from the United States and other, advanced countries. But still, a lot of efforts are going, right, as I showed earlier about the government's efforts, initiatives, to boost investments in technological innovations and industrial upgrading. So that is still, for Xi Jinping's administration, this is one of the driving force, right? We wanted to up our productivity, our innovations, to be able to both self-reliant and also to be able to grow continuously, right? The second point is the so-called Common Prosperity Campaign, which is the idea that, we have surpassed the stage where we simply want to have high growth. Now we wanted to have shared growth, shared prosperity, right? Now, many commentators say this is something that is louder in words and less in actions, but nonetheless, I think there are some policy actions and initiatives, right? Things like regulated ride-hailing industries, allow the workers to have better working conditions and fair pay, and things like, crack down the real estate sector, trying to curb the rising, housing prices, and so on and so forth, okay? Last point about regulatory scrutiny. This is antitrust regulations, especially in the tech sector, and also the data protection. And we can get to some of these if you are interested.
Quick question.
Yes.
I just saw the curbing after-school tutoring. I was just unfamiliar with that. I was curious if you could just provide some perspective in terms of how that falls in?
Yeah, I'm absolutely familiar with that because I'm the aftermath, right, of those after-school tutorial programs. No, I'm just kidding. So what happened is the government believed that if we want to have a more sort of harmonious society, if we want people to be happier, we should stop a cutthroat race in the educational system. So this idea, these private tutor programs, first of all, it's very unequal in terms of who gets the access to them. And second, it does present tremendous pressures on parents, right? They always wanted to send their kids to the after-school programs. In the old days, you guys are from all different countries. You probably know the US system is so different, right? Kids get out of school at 3, they play soccer, and what's homework, right? So there's this argument that we wanted to curb that, so then the parents are not too pressured to spend too much money on education and spend too much sort of work on this, right, and increase the anxiety level. So this is one of the things to crack down on these for-profit tutorial programs. But of course, there are a lot of debates, a lot of critiques about that, right? Because this is a sector that employs a lot of people, and it's a huge sector. It results of hundreds of thousands of job losses, right? And some of the market value of some of the listing companies that do these kinds of things, they saw their stock value evaporated overnight by like 80%. But in any case, I think this is one of the so-called common prosperity campaign is to ease the anxiety level of society. In China, they call it 3 mountains: healthcare, education, and elderly care. Housing price, right? Those are the 3 burdens on people. So this is one of the initiatives to reduce the educational expenses. Yeah. Okay. All right, so I'm getting there, and feel free to ask more questions. This is wonderful. So what I think, I think I need to go back to quickly here. So the recent slowdown, the Chinese economy has grown at an average about, double digits growth, right, before, say, 2015, right? And in most years, we have seen slowdown in the economy, average about 5-6%. Right? The most recent target the Xi Jinping administration set up is 5.5%. So there is this idea that China is slowing down. We're not growing at 9%, 10% anymore. We're growing in 5%, 6%, or even 3% or 2%, right? When the economy was hit by the coronavirus, that year China's growth rate is 2.2%. But again, still envious by the rest of the world. But the problem here is, the diagnosis is, well, the Chinese people are getting old before they get rich, right? So this population dividend is dissipating. Okay, so what do we do about that? There's the imbalances that we mentioned earlier. Too much investment, not enough consumption. So we need to reduce investment, right? However we can do that. There's the withering reform. Some of the argument is that, the state is taking over the private sector. So that is why it's slowing down. There's slowdown in the urbanization efforts. There's also more inward-looking orientation, right, in the name of dual circulation. There's also the argument that, well, that's because China is managing its growth in a more sustainable way, right? We want to decrease energy intensity. We want to transition out of the carbon, intensive economy. So all of these could keep a brake, right, on the economy. There are other reasons: inequality, social instability, and also geopolitical tensions, what have you. So, yes, these difficulties are real, right? Some are more important than others. Some are more, I would say, grounded, right? Are more substantiated by others. But through a Mmmt's perspective, right? What can we do, right? So I would say what I would propose is, in the short run, to shore up the economy that is very much hampered by the coronavirus and the strict lockdown, right? Which in some ways I think, is a choice of some of the sort of the Chinese people, right? We're trying to minimize the death, right? There's a lot of still elderly are not vaccinated. It's also a very populous country, very uneven distribution of healthcare facilities. So there might be reasons for the government to have those strict lockdowns. But the point is we have to help the people to maintain their livelihood, right? At the same time saving their lives. So I would advocate for cash transfers, cash handouts for the population. I know Randy would say, well, we want job guarantee, right? It's much better than cash transfer. I get that. But with a very strict lockdown, it's impossible for people to go to work, right? Or the Chinese have the so-called closed loop system. 20,000 financial professionals, they live in their office, right? So there are some of that. Some people can still work and they still are going to go to work. But I do think that we need to help people to pay rent, right? To pay utility and so on and so forth. So I do believe some cash handouts are necessary. Subsidizing payrolls, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises, not only keep the jobs and income, but really help the supply side of the economy as well, right? So that reduce some of the inflationary pressure. Infrastructure spending. Some people say China invests too much in infrastructure. Well, in recent years, we actually see slowdown in infrastructure spending, which is that big, bold, great line that says infrastructure. So as you can see, since 2017, we have seen a decline in infrastructure spending. So now the government is planning on $2.3 trillion of investment in 1 year to up that, right? And the US number is definitely dwarfed by that. So I've shown you many of graphs, right? So I feel like now I earn my rights to show some just like pictures. The left one is the solar panels, right? It's in Shanxi province. And the right, I think, I just put it out from Twitter. So just to show the high-speed railway, how it mushroomed, right, from 2008 to 2020. So I do think that infrastructure investment is still very helpful. Not to mention the construction works and so on and so forth are less, subject to virus and so on. But yes, we wanted to build more digital infrastructure, more social housing, and new energies, right? And also, I would argue that the central government need to beef up the transfers to the local governments. So remember earlier I showed you that build up, right? So for one, I think, again, the central government needs to increase their spending, so then it would help the private sector to not to take too much debt, right? If the government spending helps to increase the gross profits and allow people to generate income and savings, that would help to reduce the debt burden, not the other way around, because government debt is not born the same as the private debt, right? So here is just some charts that shows the distribution between the central government's debt to GDP and the local government's debt to GDP. So the local government are much more financially constrained. So the central government needs to increase the transfers. They are planning for $1.5 trillion, which is an 18% increase than last year, but I think that still needs to be increased because, well, I can share some of the anecdotals, but let's just move on to the last point here. The long-term measures, I would say, increase the social spending. China's social spending is still relatively low compared to the OECD standards. Education as one example, China invests about 4.1% of the GDP in education, which is, oops, sorry, wrong way. So 4.14% of GDP to education. This is actually 2017 number. And compared to other countries, it's still low. I think Japan and Russia spent less, probably largely because they already have so much of college, degree holders in their population. So yes, I think that social spending would be very helpful, especially when you think about the so-called dissipating or missing, population dividends. You wanted to improve that, skills and productivities and so on and so forth. Okay, so I'll just make one last point. Did somebody remind me that I'm over time? Oh, okay. Sorry. So the second point here, I would, again, just as example, I think tax reform to help with redistribution is important. I think maybe some have already mentioned, right, from a MMT's perspective, tax is not about financing government spending, right? But tax serves many other purposes, right? Keep your currency valuable and acceptable, redistribute, right? And to incentivize and disincentivize certain behaviors and actions. And all of these, I think, are important. So in Chinese case, the tax revenues of the government relies mostly from the value-added tax, very little on income tax. And as a result, the tax system is not very progressive, right? So when you look at that blue column, which is the Gini coefficient before the transfer and tax programs, and then the little triangle there is after. Actually, it's the reverse, sorry. The triangle is the market income, the Gini coefficient based on that. And then the column here, the red one, is after all these tax and spending programs by the government, how the Gini coefficient looks like, right? So again, it barely changed. So that just goes on to show that the tax system is not very progressive in redistributing. And that is one of the arguments that many scholars were saying, if Xi Jinping is real about common prosperity, we ought to reform the tax system, right? So other things would, I think, pretty straightforward, that we want to continue to finance for the sustainable urbanization, meaning we have to build infrastructure to be able to allow, hundreds of millions of people to move from the rural sector to the urban sector. We also need to continue to invest in green energy for that transition. Okay? All right, so I'm going to stop here, and feel free if you have any questions, comments, or gentle critiques. Yes?
Thanks very much for that. So I saw you cited Untitled, who did the great work on Trumpetarian and Keynesian.
Oh, yes.
Analysis of development.
Yes.
I remember one of the things he said was that the savings of households essentially allowed high investment demand and also current account surpluses with the rest of the world without causing internal overheating for the Chinese economy. And I know Stiglitz has argued the same for other countries. So is that kind of fair to say that indirectly perhaps borrowing is funding investment, at least in the way that it's offsetting unsustainable increases in demand?
So what helped to sustain the unsustainable demand? You said that, is it exports?
Well, if they've got high exports, so lots of money is coming in, and also high investment, so that is also increasing demand. The fact households are saving a lot, or the private sector saving a lot, her seems to argue that stop the economy overheating in a kind of indicating that you do need to offset with policies like that in certain examples.
Yeah. So I think in some sense, the savings is a result of the high investment growth and also the willingness of the rest of the world, especially the United States, to net import from China, right? So in a sense, it's not that because we have too much saving, therefore we have more investment and therefore we're able to net exports, right? I think it's the reverse, right? Is that high investment and high net exports that allow the private sector to generate savings.
So that's what I'm saying, it's like the savings
right.
remaining as savings and not leading to higher consumption.
Right.
So
right.
Yeah, people saving rather than spending the money that's come in from investment or from
right. Right. So, well, I think there is a distinction between investment growth, consumption growth, which is growing, right? People do consume more because they have higher income, but then still have more left to save. But when you talk about the consumption share of GDP, it is relatively small, and it has gone up for a while since the imbalances where the Premier Wen Jiabao talked about this in the late 2000s, and so there were some efforts to rebalance the economy, especially after the so-called the crackdown on the so-called shadow banking system to reduce informal financing that drive up too much, unproductive investment. We do see some rebalance where consumption share started to rise. But then the argument here is, because of the COVID, right? Now we're seeing the government again ramp up investment, so we could see another reversal of investment share being too high. But I think, again, there's a difference between when you think about what you mean by sort of overheating, right? So I think if the consumers are consuming more, right, when you have this healthy supply of products, I don't think that would create overheating in the sense of commodity or just general price inflation. But when it comes to some sectors, for example, housing sector, yes, a lot of the household wealth is being invested in the housing market. And a lot of the real estate developers were able to borrow a lot to invest in real estate. So that does drive up prices, especially in big cities like Beijing and Shanghai. So that's what prompted the Chinese government to stipulate the so-called 3 lines back in 2020. The idea that we want to rein in those real estate developers, excessive borrowing, excessive property market developments. And so, some of you must have heard about the Evergrande, problem, right, crises. So that is, I think if you mean overheating where some of the property market, right, some of the asset market is being sort of inflated, I would say we do see some of that in the housing market.
I guess just to cut, I'm more talking about the historical development of China. And like using it as a case study for other countries where you are increasing huge amounts of investment. We saw it in the Soviet Union and other countries where you're making huge capital investments.
Yes.
But you don't yet have the supply to feed everyone. So in some regards, increasing or encouraging households to delay consumption through increasing the savings rate can be a helpful thing. I think that's what he seems to be arguing. And he was arguing for
I see where
China in the future to build up domestic consumption rather than relying on running trade surpluses with the rest of the world. And I was interested as well, like, whether you think that's changed? Right.
So yes, I mean, even from a historical perspective, I'm not sure to what extent that argument is true. I mean, in some ways, again, this idea of forced saving somehow made households cut their consumption so then they can save more. I mean, again, what we have seen in China, the national saving is not just coming from the household sector. So household sector may well save more. I mean, in terms of the sort of marginal propensity to save, because maybe they're more thrift, or maybe they just worried about, the precautionary savings, right? They're worried about not have the money to send kids to school or for the elderly, so they save more. But I think the most important reason for China to be able to generate larger savings is because that high income growth. So even if you're not a very thrifty person, right, when your income grows so much, you simply have more to consume and yet still have more to save to save. So I don't necessarily buy this argument about the way to somehow force the households to save, either by way of the so-called financial repression, keep the interest rate low, keep the interest rate high, keep saying low, keep the interest rate too high, so then the households try to save more and spend less. Yeah. Am I the moderator? Or just
yes.
Okay. Patricia, go for it.
You mentioned capital controls.
Yes.
Very often in relation to China, people interpret that as just, manipulating the exchange rates. What other capital controls did China use?
Yeah, so the most important ones are, again, to distinguish, the foreign direct investment and the portfolio investment. So for a long time, I think at least before 2020, so all the way from 1994 to 2020. So the foreign direct investment in China, they're also having a higher standard to be qualified as foreign direct investment in the first place. For example, the OECD standard is you have to invest 10% of the equity, right? So, but China, they have a higher standard. I believe it's 20%. So, and then they have very sort of strict regulation system, duration requirements, sectoral development, regulations. So there are all these, prohibited lists that they don't want foreign investors to go in, right? So there are a lot of these sort of regulations in terms of what the foreign investors can come in and invest in. So for acquiring just stocks and bonds, they have to go through many different hoops, right? They have to, for example, have through some of the so-called connection, that the government set up some sort of connectors in Hong Kong, so then foreign investors would have to invest in China's stock market by way of going through Hong Kong stock exchanges and so on and so forth. So there are many different sort of, I would say, regulations, right, to distinguish foreign direct investment from the rest. And foreign investment is welcomed, but still under very, stringent scrutiny.
So these
Yeah.
are qualitative controls as opposed to quantitative?
Yes.
controls.
Yes. There are also quantitative controls in terms of, for example, the foreign investors are not allowed to own certain percentage of equity, but not a general control in terms of how much dollar amount you can invest in China. Yeah. Yeah. So as late as 2016, that's the last year number that I was looking at, that the foreign holding of Chinese banking assets is less than 2%. So that just goes to show, how important that kind of financial regulation, I think someone mentioned earlier, coupled with the kind of capital account control. Yeah. Yes, you've been very patient. Sorry, what?
This will be the last question.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry. I know I'm always taking too much time than I should, but go ahead, please.
I was wondering on how you would judge the role of Mmt-based policy in the sense of building geopolitical resilience against potential embargoes of foreign nations, because just right now the Biden administration emphasized that if China were to supply weapons to Russia, they would also be sanctioned. And I developed a feeling that China in its unique position is able to build some resilience by adopting Mmt-based policies.
Right. So I would say maybe two things on that. One is I would echo what Fadal and other colleagues have talked about earlier. So I think that resiliency really means that you have to have your food security, you have to have your energy security, you have to have your tech, right? Tech independence. So I think all of these, in some ways, China are doing that. And they have been pretty smart in doing some of the small things. One example is, right now the Chinese, if you follow that inflation rate right now, this month's data is about 2.3%. One of the things is they have built up some of the sort of stockpiles of grain, for example, in the past 2 years. So that really helped to reduce the prices of grain and rice and pork. They have strategic stockpile of pork, right? Because that's the main meat Chinese consume. So I would say, yes, I would agree. Those three things are very important to build resilience. And in terms of the very specific policies right now, I think Xi Jinping there are some anecdotes, right, that Xi Jinping has, asked people about, what can we do to help Russia, but not, really do it in face of the NATO or the US for that matter. But I don't think China is going to really, have a huge role to play, because I think there is a lot more other considerations as to China's political and economic priorities than simply helping Russia, right? And then the second thing, I think many people were arguing about if China wants to build a parallel system like SWIFT, right, which in some ways would reduce China's reliance on dollar and dollar reserves. It is a very tricky question. The Chinese high-level sort of policy-making people already worried about it, right? Apparently, they had a conference where there was a question about, how do we diversify out of the $2+ trillion of dollar reserves? And it was silent, right? No one knows exactly how to do that. So China has been developing the SIPs, right? The interbanking sort of clearing system within China, but its scale, it really it's paled by the SWIFT system. So at this point, again, I don't really see how, in terms of that international currency status, I don't think that China is making much headway. The RMB was a much more important vehicle currency back in 2013, and then that sort of share of international transactions by RMB has actually declined since very noticeably, I think, since 2015. So in terms of how to build China up for that resilience, I do think that the three things, right, food, energy, and tech, it's important, and China is doing with some success on that. But then in terms of challenging the international monetary system, unfortunately, I think China still has a long way to go. Even people like Ray Dalio will say, now is the Chinese world, right? The Chinese yuan is going to somehow rise to challenge the US dollars, but I think we're yet to see that happening. Yeah. All right.
Thank you very, very much.
All right, thank you.